Jonathan Blow burst into the video game zeitgeist in 2008 with the launch of his infamous indie platformer Braid, and last year he released his follow-up, The Witness, a first-person puzzle game set on a mysterious island. But despite his influence in the video games world and how often the games press likes to quote him, we know very little about Jonathan's life. So last month when we shot our mystery documentary, we sat down with Jonathan in an art gallery a few blocks from his studio in San Francisco's Mission District. There we talked for 4 hours about his young life, the multitude of games his code can be found in, his decade-long career in the industry prior to Braid, and how The Witness stems from a fascinating idea he had long before he ever found success.
My first exposure to video games was the early arcade games. I think, like there would be the deli around the corner from the house would have asteroids or something, right? Scramble, games like that. Games that were pretty early and not particularly good by modern standards. My parents would keep me busy or something by giving me a quarter, and I'd run down or a block or two away, play some game with the quarter and come back and beg them for another quarter. I suppose there were better ways to spend my time, I don't know. But that was pretty early, and then we got an Atari 2600 game console at home. I just really loved to just sit there and play the games on that, which, again, were very primitive by modern standards.
What were some of your favorites?
I liked Adventure, actually, the most. I think we didn't get that one till a little later. Like early on, we had Combat and Air-Sea Battle. I really liked the Raiders of the Lost Ark game, which a lot of people consider one of the bad games of the 2600 because it's just so arbitrary and weird. But I liked it. I think I liked that it was so long form, in terms of this happens and then that and then that and then, most games on the 2600 there's sort of a one game mode happening and here's the rules of the thing and then that's it. And I guess also E.T. was one of those games that was more structured, but I never really played that one because even I knew that was supposed to be bad back then. That was sort of it for consoles, specifically. When I got into the 6th grade, I was lucky enough to be in a school that had a computer class at that time, which was kind of rare, I think. This was in northern San Diego County. We had a class there that had a room full of Commodore VIC-20s, which were, again, not the most capable of computers, but that was my favorite thing at school. I was just doing, I got it right away. So my parents saw that I was really into that, and so they got a computer for home, what was known in the US as the TRS-80 color computer from Radio Shack. But I learned to program on that. I was programming in assembly language on that at a pretty young age. Messing around, they had, you could go to Radio Shack and you could buy a book full of learn how to program in BASIC and here's all these exercises. And this, they'd sell it to you by saying, this is a month worth of exercises and I'd do it in a week or 4 days, right? And then there's book number 2, and then after that there was no more stuff. And back then, it was harder to learn things than it is now because there wasn't an internet connecting you to everybody. And I knew there were books that had other information, but I didn't know what those were. I made little games and stuff even in high school time, but I didn't have ideas for games. It was more I wanted to program games. So I would program things that were my version of something else, right? So the most game-like thing I did was kind of a Pac-Man parody game. The idea was just that the score was really high because I was noticing score inflation in arcades and stuff. Right. And so you'd start eating the pellets and your score would be I guess the screens were 28 columns or something, but your score would be 15 digits all of a sudden, right? For every pellet. And other than that, it was kind of the Pac-Man game, right? So it wasn't more smart than that.
In an age before the internet, Jonathan hoped that his thirst for learning would be quenched when he started college. He traveled north to the Bay Area, to the University of California, Berkeley, where he double majored in computer science and creative writing. Perhaps there he would find the answers he was looking for.
In college they teach you a very different kind of programming than you're gonna develop on your own. I mean, they communicate a body of knowledge, and some of that knowledge gets you further than you were, and some of that knowledge is, let's say, limiting or wrong ideas that are based on assumptions about how things should be, that don't necessarily hold very well in games, for example, because games, they're really complicated to program. Performance is very important for most games, right? And so you're just trying harder to get things done than you would if you were like making a web page or something, right? And so ideas, when you try to bring some idea of how to program into games, it gets tested more thoroughly than it does in other kinds of programming, I think. So there were certain ideas of how to program that I kind of eventually learned to abandon. I was a double major in computer science and creative writing. I didn't get either degree. I dropped out before either, but
how much was left?
I probably had like 3 classes that I had. So it was like less than 1 semester to finish. For writing, it would have been more than that.
Why'd you drop out?
Because I was tired of going to school and I wasn't happy there. Yeah, that was it mainly.
Disappointed, John dropped out of college and paid the bills with a corporate programming job recommended to him by a friend. But he didn't last long there either. Looking for a job that interested him, John embarked on a meandering career of short gigs and contract work. The first step on his journey was landing a job at technology company Silicon Graphics, where he would end up working on one of the biggest games ever made. Well, sort of.
They were making like a set-top box that they were testing back when that was a thing, that they were testing in Florida and Japan, and it was this big, corporate thing. But they wanted some games to run on there, so I actually ported Doom and Doom 2. Wow. It was sort of the same executable with different data files at that time to this like cable set-top box, which on the one hand was cool, but on the other hand, it was like you were playing it with like a crappy TV controller from 1994. Like it just wasn't. You're pressing these rubber gummy things to like try and Doom is fast, right? And it was, in my opinion, not that playable, but it worked.
Did you get all the music and everything in there?
Yeah, it was fully good.
Multiplayer.
Yeah. I actually, so at the time that I finished my contract, I had actually just put in something that broke multiplayer, and the guy who came after me had to fix it.
This guy, we're trying to get away from doing Doom documentaries.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, Doom was a big game at that time, you know that. Anyway, though, after that, I then, in around February of 1996, started a game company here in San Francisco with a friend of mine from college. And
it's a good time to start a game company.
No, no, it was not. It was the absolute worst time. I pretty much think we couldn't have picked a worse time. All the game companies were like, okay, we have to be 3D now, and nobody understood how much harder it was. Like everybody knew, okay, it's more involved than 2D, whatever, but nobody really knew. And budgets were going way up, and so as a couple of guys walking in like, oh, we've never been in games before, but we're just gonna compete with regular game companies and win. It's hard. Like we walked in right when it got hard. And it didn't help that we were doing something a little early. Like we were doing an online only 32 player drop in, drop out science fiction hover tank combat game. It was a challenging thing to do back then because doing like 32 players over 9600 baud modems was entertaining. It was playable in like 97, and then we just kept working to make it better and try to get enough people to play it that we wouldn't go out of business, which eventually didn't ever happen. So that was not a financially successful game company ultimately, but it was, I learned really a lot about being good at programming, and also I just put in the hours. Like part of being good at programming is you just got to do it a lot. So after that company went out of business, we shut it down. I was a consultant for a while, and I worked at random game companies for periods of between 1 and 6 months each. So I was at Oddworld for a little bit. I was actually at Ion Storm Austin for a little bit, and I did some stuff on the engine team. Some little bit of my code may have ended up shipping in like Deus Ex 2 or Thief 3. I did some weird business stuff. So when Harmonix was going to get bought by MTV, I like went and reviewed their code for MTV to make sure there weren't like legal landmines in it or whatever. I don't know. It was kind of weird, but whatever. I got to hang out with the Harmonix guys, and that was fun. Yeah, I did programming on Flow. When that game company was starting, they were smaller than I think they grew to be a little later, and they were just trying to ship on the PS3, and it's a challenging machine to program for that sometimes you just need more people working on it. So I did some, particle stuff on that game, like got it running on the co-processors on the PS3 and stuff. It was not the main programming on the game. The main programming on the game was all them, but I had like a little contribution. I did a thing in New York that was before the PlayStation 3 existed. IBM and Toshiba and Sony had this cell processor, and Sony obviously had a long-term plan, but then those other companies were trying to figure out what to do with it. And IBM does servers, and they were like, maybe we can sell servers with this thing in it. So we did again, like a 3D multiplayer action game that was about, it wasn't a hover tank, you were like a dude in like a hard suit this time. But it was kind of cool technically, because part of the idea was to justify this being a server-based thing, you have to have a reason for that. And the reason was, well, if you do heavy physics simulation, if you do that on all the clients will have different ideas about exactly what's happening, and they'll diverge, and that's no good. So the server has to run the physics, really. Even if you predict it locally on the client, it has to get corrected by the server. So we did this really physics-based thing where we had giant robots walking toward a city, and they were self-locomoting. So instead of playing animations, they would like apply forces to their joints and stuff, and you could like blow up the joint, and it would like still try to walk like with the broken. So that was fun, but it never shipped in a way that we tried to license it to EA at some point before the PS3 came out, and they were not interested.
That's super forward thinking, because that's kind of what Microsoft were attempting to do with their cloud stuff, and like Crackdown was like have all the physics happen server side.
Yeah, I actually am not sure it's that great of an idea, ultimately. Well, I mean, back then I was just doing programming, right? But now as I think about it from a design standpoint, it's like, it's really expensive to be running all that stuff, that extra physics, versus just letting people do their thing on the client. And so result of running that physics has to be really good. And the idea back then was that the thing that we were doing would have been good, but we didn't really have the manpower to do it. It was two guys, and then we had so a friend of ours sort of corralled some college students to do the modeling and texturing and stuff. But it was not what you would call a large team effort.
Since dropping out of college, John had become quite the prolific contractor, building up a varied resume of experience. But as he worked on more and more games, John was beginning to realize that perhaps programming wasn't as creatively fulfilling as he would have hoped, and that his curiosity was pulling him towards design.
Well, I wasn't that happy because I didn't really know what I was doing in life yet. I was just sort of stumbling forward like people do sometimes, and doing the best that I knew how to do, which at that time was programming. Like, I was identified as a programmer, right? I didn't really identify as a game designer. There was an idea that, hey, I would do an independent game of my own, but it never quite happened for various reasons. Probably one of the main reasons was because all my ideas were based on ambitious technology, and I would always pick things that were a little bit too hard for me to really do. So one of the other many things I was doing while I was consulting and stuff, I was doing a workshop at the Game Developers Conference every year called the Experimental Gameplay Workshop, which was a new idea back then of like, hey, there's not that many people making little games, and even when they do, they tend to make them very traditionally, but if you're making a little game, you could actually be deliberately experimental about what you make. You could just try something very strange that most people don't do, and because it's a small game that doesn't cost $10 million, you could do that, right? And so I ran a workshop every year that tried to encourage people to do this, and that would show sort of the best of what people had done in the previous year, and so the best according to us.
As curator.
And so I was thinking about that all the time, and that was another way of refining my designs. Like, is this a wacky, weird idea that doesn't result in something, or is this like a nice game? And There was a trend back around, I don't know, the early 2000s of, it was a short-lived trend, but of like gestural interfaces. So there was games like Black and White where you would cast your spells by drawing a shape on the screen, right? And Arx Fatalis, which was the RPG version of that, where you would cast a spell by drawing a shape on the screen, and then, you know, what would happen is the game would introduce new spells to you. Like you'd find a scroll and it would have the shape on it, and you're like, oh, I can do that now. But in both those games, the thing was that there was no reason to really draw a shape, because all it was doing, it was like if you draw a specific shape, do a specific input, right? You could have had those things bound to function keys, and like serious players of those games would, right? If you were playing them competitively, you definitely would. You wouldn't be sitting there drawing a shape. So in some sense, that was an idea that was not fully realized, right? Because it is interesting to draw those shapes, but if it doesn't, if it's a worse way of doing something that you already could do, then what is it, right? So one of the things that I showed at this workshop was I spent some months, I don't remember how long, but I was doing an experiment where it was like Arx Fatalis style spell casting, but you would actually control parameters of a spell with the shape that you draw. So you would start and you would draw, like, I don't know, you would have sort of a shape where you have a horizontal line, and then you sort of cut downward, and then you have a loop. And that would be like a magic missile spell. And then you could control different things. Like you had a certain amount of line length to spend total on the thing. And if you made the loop like bigger or smaller, you know, that would be like a bigger or smaller missile in terms of how much damage it would do. Like you could spend some upping the speed, right? And then there was another parameter somewhere in the shape about how much it would track the target. I had planned out this game where you would learn these spells. Most of the spells would come in the traditional way, like you'd be going through a dungeon and you'd find a book and the book would have a spell in it. The thing that was going to be cool, the cool moment of that game was going to be that there were shapes built into nature, right, in the environment, and these were the most powerful ones. And you know, you could probably get through the game without discovering them, but if you discovered them, they were super cool. So just one picture that I had was you're on top of a mountain and I don't know, maybe you climbed way up there and maybe you went through a dungeon to get to the top or something, but you're up there and you look down and sort of the path that you took to get up there looked a lot like one of these spell shapes, and if you realized that, then you could learn something new, right? And so that was the whole idea for that game, and could have made that game, but I felt down enough on the actual spell casting mechanic that I was like, I don't really feel like this is one of those ideas that's really going to execute well. So what do I do? And all this was before I did Braid anyway, right? And so I kind of tabled that, probably did some other stuff, and then did Braid. And then after Braid, I was trying to figure out what to do. So this was 5 years after that idea or something, right? And then I was like, well, you know, I still like that vision of being up on the mountain and looking down and seeing this thing. And well, the thing that I did on Braid was to, you know, I had some idea about time manipulation platformer, and the thing that worked for me on that was to minimalize everything that wasn't the main idea. So the going minimal was very effective for me at that time. Also with the idea of what the puzzle was. You know, the simpler the geometry of the level was in that game, the better the puzzle was, usually. So I said, well, if that's what I really like, is this picture of looking down off this mountain and realizing the significance of something that you didn't before, then why don't I get rid of everything else and start over from there, right? Maybe it's not spells. Maybe I just need a reason for you to be drawing a line, and then we'll go from there.
In the intervening years, John would have his game design breakthrough, Braid, a smart, creatively designed puzzle platformer which wowed players and critics alike. Overnight, John went from an unknown programmer jumping from contract to contract to a game design guru, in no small part due to his prominent role in the documentary film Indie Game the Movie. So years later, when it came to making his follow-up indie project, Jonathan didn't make Braid 2. Instead, he set his eyes on solving this problem he created for himself years ago, to construct a game around an epiphany he wanted players to have. The only problem was getting the player to draw a line.
So how did you land at puzzles?
I don't know. I honestly do not really remember. Like it was, I wanted an excuse to be drawing a line, and I guess I thought about solving a puzzle by drawing a line. I can't tell you exactly. Let's say you knew nothing about game design, and someone came to you and said, you're gonna design a game. It's an action game where you shoot dudes and try to avoid getting shot, right? And somebody might think, oh, well, the thing that'll make that game really good is if it's really hard to fight the guys, and it's really a challenge. But the problem with that approach is you can make them infinitely hard to beat very easily, right? Just give them the zillion health and million damage bullets, and they move infinitely fast, and they can see around, whatever, right? Like, it's trivial to make an enemy in a game unbeatable, right? It's like that with puzzles as well, right? What makes a puzzle interesting is not really difficulty. It's pretty easy to make a puzzle arbitrarily difficult. You just put more stuff in. Because more stuff will either obfuscate the real solution or just make people have to think through more combinations of things, or make the solution require many more steps, right? So you have to think through a longer sequence of stuff. And all those make it harder, but they're not really more interesting. In fact, they go in the opposite direction of interesting, because interesting is when, well, for me, one of the things that makes a puzzle very interesting is when there's a clear idea that you come to see in the process of solving it, right? You're like, oh, these two things have a relationship in the puzzle that I didn't realize until now, and now I understand what that is, and so that determines this solution, right? That idea of what is this relationship between these elements in the puzzle is the good part, and the better that idea is, the better that relationship is, or the clearer it is, or the more surprising it is, determines how good the puzzle is. Along with some other things. It's never that clear cut. And again, the way I said that sort of applies mainly to witness puzzles, but it's the same in Braid, and it's the same in many puzzle games, actually.
For 6.5 years, John created puzzles. He built a studio, Thekla, with a team of talented programmers, designers, and artists to help him achieve his vision. They started with a small island, and as their ideas evolved, the island grew to accommodate them. The Witness as it exists today is the final point of that thought process. An island full of puzzle screens, cables, shores, and castles. A game about learning without a single tutorial. Ultimately, The Witness is a game about drawing lines, but what exactly that means to you depends on what island you're looking at. This is a place that changes radically without ever moving an inch. The key to unlocking the island's mysteries is all about perspective.
So there's an intro area where you pretty much have to do everything inside it. All of those things are for the most part easy, except for one thing that's a trick gotcha. And once you get out of this tutorial area, then if you sort of see everything, the next puzzle that you see is supposed to be so hard that you actually just can't do it, right? And so we show both ends of the spectrum, like, okay, there's very easy things, and then, okay, this is really hard, but like, we're obviously not asking you to do it. It's clearly meant to be something that's like maybe a challenge that you keep in your mind as you go and come back to later. And in fact, right after you encounter that is this information that you need in the form of simpler puzzles again. So it shows people at the beginning of a little bit of variety of experience so they can get more of a picture of what's happening. And it also says, it's okay if you can't do something. And then after that part, there's easier puzzles again, so you maybe get the idea, oh, if I see a hard thing, maybe there's other easier things nearby, right? And so it's not just that those things are happening, but the player is building the model in their head of what the game is that they're playing this whole time. There's already some investment there, right? Because this understanding that I'm building is a thing that I own now, right? And if I drop it, if I stop playing and drop it, well, that's a little bit of a waste or something, right? One other thing about it is the fact that every little puzzle in the game has its own idea behind it, even if it's a very simple puzzle. And so when you do the puzzle, the idea goes into your mind, even if you don't totally realize that. When it works, it's really kind of magical, because then at the end you could ask someone, what were you trying to do when you solved that puzzle? And they'll say, well, this and that, and then this and the other thing, and they'll have some things that they can't quite verbalize because they weren't shown these things in words, right? It was this fully interactive development of how these ideas came into their mind. And I think that is, first of all, it's very interesting by itself to be a subject seeing these ideas sort of come across. But secondly, it's like a super condensed version of a thing that games do generally. And that's part of why people play games generally, right? Is, you know, you're playing Mega Man or something, right? And you get a new weapon and you're like, oh, what does this do? How does it work, right? In what context do I use this? You're building that picture over time, and you know, you push the button and you shoot a thing and you watch what, I mean, all games communicate to you in some fashion what are the nuances of the elements in this game and how do they work and how do they behave in relationship to each other, right? And so part of the idea in The Witness was to take that kind of nonverbal communication that happens in all games and boil it down to a very simple form, right? So the things that you learn about don't even move. They're, for the most part, just symbols on a screen, on a puzzle screen that's embedded in the world. And interactivity is very minimal, like nothing's gonna kill you, right? There's almost no action in the game. You just sit there and think about things and then solve it, right? And for people who don't like the game, that's one of the reasons they don't like it, is because it's so like quiet with nothing happening. But it's, I wanted to turn down the volume on that kind of event so that, you know, just by virtue of relative loudnesses, the volume comes up on seeing these ideas, right? Because if right after you did a puzzle, you had to like dodge a couple of monsters or whatever, like Dark Souls style, you have to whatever, you're not really gonna be thinking about the puzzle anymore. Whereas now, if you do it and then you're walking to a new area maybe, and you're like, oh yeah, you know, it sort of sinks in a way. We spent a lot of time just deciding what the style is like in terms of like the textures on things, or what kinds of colors happen, or what arrangements of colors can happen, because I felt that it was very important to be careful with the player's attention and to not draw the player's attention to things that are not relevant, right? If you're in an environment full of distractions, it's gonna make the game harder to play. And even if that's subtle, even if that distraction is subtle, if the puzzles are subtle, it can kind of wreck them, right? And so, again, the quietness like enables subtlety. You know, during development, a lot of the time people would make stuff that looked cool, and I was like, yeah, that looks cool, but we can't do that because you can't do anything with it. And so you have to make it more boring, otherwise people are gonna walk up to it and look around it. You know, you'll have a version of the adventure game problem, like if it's like a point and click game, like you have to try clicking on everything, right? So it's not my impression that people say that much about exactly how sparse the environments are in terms of clutter. Like, there are rooms in there and they don't have anything in them, right? And the reason is because I don't want people to feel like they can click on stuff all the time, or that they should be trying to click on things all the time. Now we also, later in the design, we ended up with this thing, only panels ever cause anything to happen, which is another way of focusing the interactivity. We used to have like buttons and levers and stuff, until I decided that was stupid.
Because then the player's looking for buttons and levers everywhere.
Totally, and you never know what might be a lever, right?
Right.
You know, there's a lot of puzzles in it. You're gonna get stuck on a lot of them. And you don't necessarily, if you're stuck, it means you don't even know exactly what you should be thinking about in many cases. Like, you just don't. The way the puzzles here are designed is it's not like you're stuck on a complex logic problem that you can't work out a lot of the time. It's like you're stuck because you just don't know how it could even be possible to do this one. I felt it important to try and organize the environment, right? So if you're in a particular biome and you don't know exactly what's relevant to this puzzle you're trying to solve, at least if you like leave the biome, you feel like you're going far away, and you're like, okay, maybe I shouldn't be out here looking for this thing, right? As opposed to older style adventure games, which didn't really have that kind of discipline. I mean, things could be anywhere, right? Objects that you could pick up in the beginning of the game would only be relevant to something toward the very end. And so I wanted to organize it and make it so that you didn't feel like you had to run across the entire world to try and find the answer to something. But The Witness is extremely nonlinear because there's a lot of puzzles in it and it doesn't really gate you. And there are pluses and minuses to that, right? The plus is that if you're frustrated with something, you can just go somewhere else. There's all this rest of this game you can go explore. The negative is that, again, if you just want someone to tell you what to do, well, a linear sequence is a way for a game to tell you what to do, right? And the more you blow that out, the more you let people just go random places and do things, the more you give them the opportunity to have a bad time for themselves, right? You know, you're just stuck in the middle of a sequence of puzzles that's by itself linear and you can just turn around and go somewhere else. And you may, somewhere else, find something that gives you ideas about what you're working on, or as often happens for, you know, I think our subconscious is always working on stuff in the background, and so you just go do other puzzles and you'll be like, oh wait, that thing, I have an idea now about that thing. So one of the things I observed back when doing Braid is that different people find different things hard, right? So some people will find one puzzle very easy that other people are stumped on for hours, and vice versa. There are some things that are universally, or mostly universally hard, but they're pretty rare. So I knew going into The Witness that I couldn't really rank the puzzles on a difficulty scale and sort of, you know, make easy areas, medium areas, and hard areas. You can kind of do that, but it's still a statistical thing where different people are gonna have a different experience. So with the audio area, for example, I knew first of all that people can recognize pitches with varying levels of ease just in regular everyday life. So if you ask them to do an audio-related puzzle, they're coming to it differently, right? Because I knew that some people have more difficulty than others at pitch recognition, that's an area where I didn't make the puzzles just crazy complicated with like a million sounds or a million steps. The direction I went in there, it's a little bit more of like being funny, but also in a way that really annoys people while they try to play, right? Because it's like sounds that try to be obnoxious and distract you from the task that you're trying to do. As a designer, I don't know exactly what experience people are going to have, right? Some people are going to find some things hard and other things easy, and then other people will have those roles swapped, right? If you design such that you kill anything that's people find hard, if you design such that you kill everything that some percentage of people find hard, then you end up getting the subset of what all those people can do, right? So, which might, you know, if your game could be this big mass, right, you end up getting this nucleus in the middle. There's all this potential that you killed, you know, just because somebody might not have a good time with it, right?
For some, The Witness is simply an island full of logic puzzles. Complete a biome to unlock a laser, 7 lasers open a mountain, and the final puzzles within. But beyond the superficial, there's something else going on in The Witness. Its puzzles come in many forms.
If we oversimplify for the sake of just explanation, then we could just call every discrete element in the game that you could understand or not understand, we'll just call that a puzzle. There's a set of layers where sort of the bottommost layer is things that are obviously puzzles, and it's obvious to some degree how you solve them. So you see this LCD panel in the environment and you know you have to trace a line, and it's obvious when you have solved it. What some people don't like about the game is like there's not enough fanfare when you succeed or whatever, but it's...
Ode to Joy doesn't play.
Yeah, exactly. It's not Peggle, right, where fireworks go off every time you solve a puzzle. But that said, it acknowledges clearly when you got the right answer to the thing. Then there's a next set of stuff where they're not clearly signaled, but once you've found them, you know that you found them. And once you solve them, you know that you solved them, right? And then there's a third layer, which is sort of more this, what we think of as visual surprises built into the environment, where they're not signaled to you in any way, and there's no acknowledgement, right? It's like either you see that and you think something about it, or you didn't. You have these explicitly acknowledged, very structured things, and then you have these less acknowledged, less structured things, and who knows how many of those are in there, right? And who knows how many you've seen, and you're not, when you see one, you're not like checking off a to-do list, right? If your to-do list has 10 things on it, then by the time you come to the end, you know you're done, right? There's no uncharted territory there. Whereas if it's just uncharted territory, you're exploring it by seeing these new things, and that's pretty cool.
John and the team had created an island of puzzles, some superficial, others less so. But the whole reason for the island was in service of that second layer he spoke of, stemming from an idea about casting spells that Jonathan had all those years ago, to create a world with rules and ideas that the player would piece together in their mind, all leading them to enjoy a powerful epiphany.
Do you find that many people have played the game and have not unraveled that sort of second layer of puzzles, haven't noticed them?
I feel like it is, so I definitely designed it to be possible or likely that people would finish the game and not find the secret stuff. I think that happens less often than I expected. I mean, it's hard to predict this kind of thing, but I would have said maybe it's 50-50, like half the people who play the game will not see that stuff. It had to be legitimately likely that you could finish the game and never see that stuff, right? Like you had to take an extra step of noticing something on your own to find that, right? Yeah, it was not handed directly to you, like, look, you know, the Nintendo fairy didn't show up and say, what is that in the left corner of the screen? Why don't you try clicking there, ... So there was the idea in it that there would be these things that you could find that were not handed to you, right? And then there's always the question, how much of the game is that? And the AAA decision would probably be that's a very small part of the game, because you want to get news out about the secret thing, word of mouth and all that, but you don't want to spend a lot of money on that because that's money that's not going into the main game, and then you'll compare badly with other games that put more money into their weapon models or something, right? But I wanted it to be a part of the game that could stand up on its own, you know, parallel to the obvious parts. That said, I didn't expect it to be quite as big as it ended up being, but I didn't expect any of this game to be as big as it ended up being.
Yeah, what happened there? How did it end up growing?
Just, you know, the way I design starts with ideas to try. And then I kind of try them and see what the consequences are and then what would be interesting. So I kind of get the ideas working in the game in a simple way and then play with them and then think about what that could lead to, right? And so where that went with The Witness was, okay, there's these panel puzzles and then you could have the symbols inside them, and there's a whole exploration of what different kind of interactions could you have between these different kinds of symbols. But then there was also this idea that information in the environment could give you the answer in some way. And then there's a whole exploration of what are the different ways that the environment could give you the answer. And when I start doing something like that, I have a feeling for if I'm filling out the idea enough or if I'm leaving a big gap that's gonna feel weird, right? So if we didn't do like shadows, that would have felt weird. Like it would have been like if a player plays your game and one obvious thing they think of is, oh, it would have been cool if they'd used shadows to do a thing, then we kind of didn't do our job a little bit, right? All the interesting things that we could think of, we ended up doing. And so that just meant we took forever to make the game.
John and the team's vision for The Witness grew over time, filling the space it occupied, finding its form. John used up what he had earned from Braid in creating this island full of ideas, even loaning money from a friend to finish the project. He released in 2016, as an increasingly oversaturated indie market was making it harder than ever for games to make money, let alone one at this scale. So, how has The Witness done?
So it's done really well, and we're going to release it on new platforms. And it didn't have to do this well. It's certainly a very weird game, right? That, as I said, was hard to say why it's exciting without spoiling it. And even if I did say that, like, it's just highly, like, you look at the trailer or something and you're like, there's like some puzzle grids with a line. Like, why do I want to play that? It's hard to communicate what is interesting about it.
Were you relieved or?
Yeah, I was
surprised?
relieved. Yeah, no, I mean, I went way into debt to make that game, and I mean, we can make a new game, and that's really great. So that's kind of all you can ask for. I mean, you can ask for more, but we're doing all right, you know?
The Witness is a game about learning, about seeing new perspectives, about the journey up the mountain and what we see when we look back. It may not be an RPG about spellcasting, but The Witness has a certain magic that is so rare in video games, the pursuit of which is crucial to John's philosophy, to create games that stay with us even after we've left them, that make us ask questions of ourselves and the world around us.
There are things that I don't totally understand, right, thematically or even just intellectually, you know, puzzle-wise, whatever. And if I don't totally understand them, but I'm interested in them, then probably a lot of people don't totally understand them. There might be some people out there who do have a very clear, and then maybe this game isn't that interesting for them. But, you know, for most people, then maybe they will also be in this territory of, I'm not sure what to make of this, or like, oh, that's interesting. I don't totally see all the ramifications of that right this second, right? And I really value that a lot. And when I design games, you know, I'm a game designer as my life pursuit. So I hope that through my life pursuit, I become a wiser person or a more developed person and all those things, all those good things that we want to be. So how is game design going to do that if I'm designing little things that I have a full understanding of? I mean, maybe there's some joy in like finer execution of the craft, right? But you know, the games that we know are on the boundary of a very unexplored territory that we don't even know how big it is, it's so large. And I feel like it's a good idea to kind of go further that direction. And also then, as we go further that direction, to not just have that be like, oh, that's some abstract, interesting game, but it's not related to the rest of my life at all, to somehow let it connect back and be relevant to what we do when we're walking around every day.
Do you have any old ideas that you're going to resurface for the next project? Is it going to take as long as The Witness?
No, no. We already have stuff in the works. There's something that I've done some work on that is gonna show up, yeah. I cannot say what it is.
No worries. We'll just play this video back in 10 years?
Yeah, no,
years?
no, it won't be that
4
long.
years?
Okay, yeah, 4, 3, something like that.
This is the part of the documentary when we say goodbye and we'll see you again in 7 or 8 years, right? That's how this works. It was Indie Game the movie, and then us, and then it'll be someone else's job in.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, our video documentary is going to be a thing in 7 or 8 years.
God, I
don't
hope
know,
so.
Right? I hope so too, but you never know. It's so crazy.
Maybe I'll learn how to program.
Maybe.